We need attachment to live. We are hardwired to form connections. You may have seen the psychology experiments in baby monkeys and how they became attached to like teddy bears that represent a parent to them. Or perhaps you've seen videos of orphaned wild animals that think that the human that found them is their mother. Well, a lot of how we perceive threats and safety in the world and the way that we connect to others is from our very early care that we received in the first 18 months of life. And that goes on to shape our relationships and our personality. Even things like narcissism is a result of an attachment wound from early childhood. And the more that you look into psychology, I find that attachment is one of those endlessly fascinating subjects that you can use as a lens to pretty much study all behavior. So to do attachment justice, I have Jessica Baum on the show, who is the author of Anxiously Attached. It's a great book that I really leaned on when I was doing my own research on attachment styles, and I found her an incredibly proficient speaker when I heard her on other podcasts, so I invited her onto the show to lend me a hand on the topic. We really dive into the depths of attachment styles, what they are, how they were shaped by our evolution, how attachment shapes our behaviors, addictions, relationships, how to recognize your own attachment status, and what goes on in therapy for attachment and relationship issues, and what are the interventions that actually make a difference. It is a fascinating conversation, so I hope that you enjoy it as much as I did. Welcome to the show, and not to be super annoying, as someone who has written a book on attachment styles, could I ask you to explain in your own words attachment styles?
Attachment theory has been around for a really long time. It was researched first in the 1950s. And as they were researching babies and how babies interacted with their primary caregiver, they noticed at the time 3 different categories. Later, it becomes 4 categories. And the categories are in relationship to how the baby responds to connection to their primary caregiver. So the secure babies had an inherent sense of safety and trust that their needs were going to get met, and grew up with a more secure foundation in the world and struggle less in relationships. So they struggle less getting close to people. They struggle less with abandonment issues. Yeah, they just struggle less. It doesn't mean that they don't struggle. It means when they have conflict in relationship, they can get back to baseline faster and they have less fear in their system around relationships, intimate relationships, or any kind of close relationships. And then the 3 insecure categories that attachment theory defines is anxious, avoidant, and disorganized. And so depending on how the baby connects with their primary caregiver, if the caregiver is insecure, anxious, not present, you can develop something called an anxious attachment style, which is the one I wrote the book on. And this is a baby or an adult that struggles with abandonment issues, with inconsistency. And when they feel scared in a relationship, they usually try to seek closeness in order to calm themselves down. And the other end of the spectrum, we have avoidant attachment style. And true avoidant babies are raised with people who meet their needs, but aren't always emotionally attuned or present to them. So they struggle with emotional attunement, and they tend to need space in order to regulate their nervous system. So anxious and avoidant people tend to attract each other later in life, which makes up the anxious avoidant dance, which I go into a lot of detail about. And then disorganized babies struggle with either abuse or extreme terror, where we really need our primary caregiver because connection is a biological imperative, but our caregiver is also scaring us at the same time. So we get stuck in a state of like, I can't get too close. And I also can't, leave. So it's a very scary feeling. And that can show up in your romantic life or in your life later on. Or for me, I had pockets of that show up in my life. So I would say a growth mindset to looking all of these things is looking at how your nervous system and your attachment patterns show up in your romantic or personal life and how that might trace back to early connections that you made with your parents. And kind of the stretch here is we reenact our adaptive strategies from when we were little and later in life. So the growth mindset is just to be open to that concept.
Cool. That was a really interesting overview. So one thing was, I thought avoidant was perhaps related to learning that it's bad to share your emotions, and so you kind of don't. Is that incorrect?
It's not totally incorrect. Avoidant babies or children, they learn that their emotional needs aren't going to get met. So what's the point? And often they are focused on tasks at hand or being successful in doing things. So they disconnect sometimes from their own emotional experience. And their parents usually don't see into their emotional experience. So their own connection with their own emotions sometimes is limited. And when they did try to share emotionally, often that wasn't well received. So they learn what's the point.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. Have you looked much at the concept of metacognition in development and how we just develop concepts in our mind and then use them as a reference point in later life?
I would say that we develop, I wouldn't call it metacognition, but I would call it a belief system or a paradigm of how we see the world based on our earliest experiences. And that lens gets laid over to all of our interactions and how we kind of show up in life.
So it's just quite interesting in terms of like a child actually thinks the world is flat until it goes to school and gets taught that the world isn't flat. And it's like a concept that's kind of hard to change, but isn't too hard to do at that age. But back when the first person thought the world wasn't flat, it was really hard for them to teach all adults that the world wasn't flat. But now I don't even think about the concept that the world is flat because if it's just a concept that's tied into my head, I don't have to think about it. If you tell me about the globe, I just know exactly what you're talking about. But as a concept in your head, just sort of attachment on what's going on when someone is relating to you, is you just have a bunch of concepts that are now in your head of what everything means. If someone is like not listening to you, it's like a really bad sign, whereas actually someone else might perceive that as just, hey, this person's busy. Just means a lot of different things to you compared to someone else, and that's just built, I guess.
Well, I think that we embed certain responses to connection, and we can develop like a self-concept that no one loves me, or I'm always going to be left, or connection is scary, or it's not safe. And those concepts get laid down, and they're usually the felt experience that we have in our body. And we can project and kind of reenact different scenarios throughout our life that prove those self-concepts right. And so that's when we can get stuck in a lot of patterns that are quite painful patterns, because we have these let's call them core wounds or self-beliefs attached to core wounds that are unhealed. And then they show up in our life and we look for ways to confirm our belief system. And so we have to have disconfirming experiences in order to challenge those self-concepts.
Yeah, that's very powerful in terms of the concept of when you're looking for problems, you find problems, but then you prove yourself the value of looking for problems because you always find them. And then you get stuck in a cycle. Okay, so the obvious question is, how do you perform those interventions to prove yourself wrong? And I guess maybe that's a bit too general, but how would you do that for, say, anxious attachment then?
Yeah. So if you have an anxious attachment, you might want to locate the wound of people aren't going to show up for me, or people aren't consistent, and feel into your body as to how true that was when you were little, because it probably was very true, right? What you're feeling and this self-concept actually existed for you at one point in time. So we want to validate the original wound or the original belief system. And then we want to recreate in your current reality some relationships that contradict that. So finding relationships that really can support you and be consistent in your life and that you can learn to depend on. Might not be the boyfriend or girlfriend that you were thinking about, but it might be a coach and a therapist and an aunt or whatever. And we start to develop new experiences of being close to people who are actually reliable and dependable, to retrain not only the self-belief, but the nervous system to expect different things than what we were used to from new relationships.
You mentioned earlier that you had pockets of disorganized showing up in your life. Could you explain what that means in terms of like how that actually happened?
Sure. I had pockets of disorganized when I was in a relationship where the other person shut down on me and stopped talking to me for a while. And some of the behaviors that they did were very extreme. And so my system felt very unsafe about like not being seen and not being talked to. And they were coming and leaving. And so the disorganized was I couldn't orient to them anymore because they were not even making eye contact with me. So a part of me felt very threatened by that. And, I had a lot of pain in my stomach and I felt like I was not balanced because the person I was attached to, they were in a lot of pain and they were doing all these behaviors that just really felt challenging for my system. So luckily, I only experienced pockets of that. I don't live in disorganized every day. But one of the messages I am getting across is that we don't just embed one attachment style, that attachment is a two-way street. And it's my patterns and combined with your patterns. And if there's safety in the relationship, we can learn and grow together. If there isn't, sometimes we can get more disorganized or more anxious or more avoidant. So depending on who we partner with, like I might be more anxious with someone like a romantic partner and more avoidant with a girlfriend. Like we can show up with different patterns in different relationships.
Sure. In the same way that introverts still like to be social and go to a party sometimes. And if they're around someone that's bubbly, they're more likely to do some exciting things. Whereas if they're around a bunch of other introverts, they'll just read a book all day or something. So in terms of, you mentioned most of your attachment style comes from when you're young, but depending on who you're with, that can also drive the attachment style that you're exhibiting and perhaps also reinforce attachment styles or push them further.
Yeah, but you have to remember that who you're with in the present, let's say if you're anxious and you're with someone avoiding, is waking up early memories around connection when you're small. So the reason why you have intense sensations in your stomach and your heart when someone's acting very avoidant is because you had that experience and those are memories being woken up. So all of our intense experiences in relationship now usually have roots in our nervous system and our earlier experiences in life, or else we would just walk away from the person and we wouldn't be so impacted.
Okay, that makes sense. Glad I asked. Okay, so I think there's lots to dig into in terms of different ways to help with your attachment style, but I think it'd be worth looking into some other just general terminology around things first to understand it better. So you've spoken about regulating yourself and co-regulation. Could you explain more about that, please?
Sure. So when you're a human baby, you're not born with a parasympathetic nervous system. You're only born with a sympathetic nervous system. And that's a part of your nervous system that reaches out and cries. And that's the part we use for fight or flight. And that's the part we can use to get mom's attention. Mom is, if she's really well grounded and has a sense of safety, she has co-regulation, comes from a sense of her parasympathetic nervous system lended to the baby to calm the baby back down, to soothe the baby. So we actually depend on co-regulation early on to feel safe in the world. So that means our mom has to feel safe in order to lend that to us. If she's too anxious, we don't learn to get that co-regulation. And sometimes we even end up trying to regulate her nervous system. That's primarily what happens in an anxious person. We'll meet the needs of the primary caregiver. So later on, when you grow up in life, you might not have the ability to self-regulate because you didn't get a lot of co-regulation. And so we need the co-regulation in order to develop the self-regulation. And that's why anxious people and sometimes just really insecure people with any style struggle. And they can turn to substances, we can turn to people, we can turn to food, we can turn to anything that try to regulate our nervous system because we didn't get proper co-regulation. The self-regulation is not wired. So we need a lot of co-regulation as an adult to internalize that experience to start to develop the neural pathways for self-regulation.
Is there any form of regulation that someone could reach to that would be healthy versus working out how to regulate themselves? Because I'm assuming reaching towards drugs to regulate yourself is a bad idea.
Reaching out to someone like that can co-regulate you is the best, right? So reaching out to somebody who can be there for you and hold space for you while you're upset and help bring you back down, that's actually the best way to work through things. When you have a sense of that person, you might be able to use their spirit and their energy to calm yourself down. Also, the respiratory system is one system we have access to that can trick our body back into safety. So extending our exhales can get us out of fight or flight or any kind of survival state back into a state of back into our parasympathetic or just back into a state of calm. So those are two healthy ways. Another human being there for you and breathing are two natural ways to get your system to try to get back into homeostasis.
What did you find worked best for you when you first realized that you had issues with your own regulation of emotions if you were being triggered in terms of your attachment style?
For sure, a lot of my work I've done by leaning on dependable people. And so co-regulation is really where it's at. For any anxious person, it's not that we're too needy, it's that we need to depend on people who have the capacity to be there for us. And the more we can depend on the right people, the more interdependent we become.
Which was perfectly my next question on when it came to terminology, to understand things better, the concept of dependency and interdependency. Could you elaborate more on that area?
Sure. And I would say like codependency and dependency is built on fear, right? And so I need you to be a certain way for me to feel safe, and you need to be a certain way. And we might have to control certain things in each other's lives to feel safe, right? And interdependency is built on trust. So I know I have an inherent sense that I can trust you, but I can also be uniquely myself. I would say people who struggle with codependency, or they can't allow the other person to be a whole person, or they can't allow them to be their full self. They have to sacrifice parts of themselves to make the relationship work. And in interdependency, our whole unique self is accepted. We know that we can depend on the other person, but we also can ask for our needs. And we have a sense that that person is there for us and that we can be uniquely ourselves and have that autonomy and go about the world and still know we have support while also being uniquely ourselves rather than having to sacrifice parts.
So I think that makes the point nicely around the concept that your attachment styles can also bleed into the rest of your life. And if you struggle with maintaining your own identity in a relationship, you maybe also struggle elsewhere with it.
Yeah, I would think that you would struggle everywhere. And I think attachment issues probably influences most people's lives. Anyone who's really struggling, addiction is an attachment issue. Attachment issues kind of influence our whole lives. It's just whether or not how conscious are we of them. So yeah, definitely. I would agree that they very much, that's why I wrote a book on it, because people just don't understand how much this is influencing their love life, but also like their closest relationships. And I think once you start to realize that, it gives you some relief, and it kind of gives you a starting point on how to begin to heal.
Do you help people if you're coaching them on things like just a personal identity and creating more like a stable and safe concept of themselves, that they don't feel they need to be anything to anyone?
I think through the therapeutic relationship, you kind of foster that anyway, like an unconditional acceptance of them. I think the way in which you show up and respond to them probably is them feeling accepted the way they are, and that their reactions and their behaviors make perfect sense. And you're doing a lot of that validating and helping them understand that. And I think when somebody else can accept you the way you are and love you the way you are, your capacity to start to accept yourself and love yourself grows. Like, we need that from others, and we internalize that, and then we develop more of a capacity to give that to ourselves.
When it comes to stuff like self-help, you hear a lot of people to just diagnose something that they get told they're broken because of something and they just have to do better. But I think that helps compared to like, it makes complete sense that there is something that isn't quite right with you, or like it's a completely healthy reason that you've developed a bad attachment style, but it's also not healthy to keep it, and you should still work to improve it, but you shouldn't come from a place of like you're just broken fundamentally towards it.
Yeah, and I would not even phrase any of that like that. I would say you adapted in certain brilliant ways to stay in connection, and those brilliant adaptations are part of you. So now we want to get conscious of them so we can learn new ways to be. But there absolutely is nothing wrong with you. You just responded to your environment, and all of your responses and your adaptations actually make sense.
You asked beforehand that I sent you a case study. I was like, I do remember thinking about sending you, I'd done an episode on catastrophizing, because that could come up in attachment styles. But it was very much from a sense of like, catastrophizing makes complete sense from psychology in terms of evolution, of like so many reasons that we have built in for other ways that we understand the world that we might then catastrophize. Obviously it's bad to catastrophize, but there is plenty of sensible reasons for it. It's just working out when those reasons are like overworking and aren't helpful for you. But I didn't send you that episode, so anyway, it doesn't matter.
Well, I would say that like catastrophizing are thoughts, right? And those thoughts are just trying to match the experience that we're having inside. So if the experience we're having in our body and in our mind is extreme and unbearable, it's usually a earlier state that we will try to come up with words to explain what's going on in our body, often not even really related to what's going on. So people who are suicidal, it's like it's not that they want to kill themselves, it's that something is going on that's so painful inside, and it could be an infant experience or a totally regressed state. And it's so painful and unbearable that the adult mind thinks of ways out, right? But those states are actually earlier states of how much we suffered earlier on.
Yeah, I hadn't got as far as thinking it to suicidal thoughts, but that's actually a really interesting connection. But yeah, your ego obviously doesn't deal with the concept that your emotions don't make sense, and it just always comes up with good arguments for whatever's going on to explain it, part of which is catastrophizing. And then have you heard of the study that they did, I think in America, where they asked people something really specific, like what's the chance of a flood in this town in California due to an earthquake breaking a dam? And people gave it like a 10% chance happening like in August next year, because it was so specific and they could imagine it, even though it was so unlikely to happen. And then they also asked, what's the chance of like just a freak weather event in America that was obviously like super likely, but because it was so vague, people gave it a really unlikely chance. But if you have a picture in your head of what it is, it's very imaginable and it seems very likely. So when you're catastrophizing, you instantly create a very realistic picture, which then instantly makes it way more believable. And it's just frustrating that we have this like inbuilt function that then makes things very believable, but tends towards stuff that isn't helpful for us. On the concept of like mirror neurons and how we share traits, as in I guess that's relates to like how we pick up some of these things initially when we're young. Can you explain some of that?
Yeah, well, we take in people through resonance circuits and mirror neurons. So, as I sit here and I look at you, I'm taking in your essence through your expressions and what you look like. And so we take people in, and we do that all the time. And how we take people in and internalize them is mostly due to mirror neurons. We take our parents in. We have something I call an inner community. We have a lot of people that we take in when we spend time with them. And we even take in mirror neurons on essences of people who've harmed us. So we take in everything that way.
And then what does that mean to us? If that's a really weird question.
Well, I could tell you what it means to me. What it means to me is that we internalize people and we keep them with us, and we can access their energy and their spirit at any point because we've internalized them inside our body. We can also access them to do healing work, and they become part of what we call my inner community. So it's really cool because it makes me feel like I'm never disconnected from certain people, and I'm always working with their energy that lives inside of me and how they show up in my inner world. And that's because I've internalized them.
And then in terms of how that impacts us whilst we're growing up and our attachment styles, would we be replicating just the traits that we're observing and how someone comes across, or is it more how someone treats us that acts our emotions?
We sometimes can reenact what our parents did to us. Like I had a client yesterday whose mom was very, very critical on him growing up. He lived in the Korean culture, and he realized that he's been really, really, really critical with his kids. And he goes, the one thing that my mom did to me was the one thing I didn't want to do. And I basically said, until we heal that, we recreate it, right? So we recreate what we experienced often. There was another part of that question that I'm drawing a blank on now. The question was, how does that influence us, right? What was the question?
In terms of when we're picking up our attachment styles, is this due more to like our mirror neurons of how someone is behaving, or is it more due to the emotional state that we are feeling because of how we're being treated? Or is it a bit of a blend of different things?
So many different things. It can be their energy in that moment. It can be their emotions in that moment. It can be how they're interacting with you. I mean, someone can just pull out their phone and ignore you, and it can send an avalanche inside of you of feeling disconnected. And so it can be like we have something called neuroception, So we're always scanning for safety and threat. And what I might perceive as dangerous based on my past, like if you just don't call me back, that might kind of like, my body up might be different than what you perceive as dangerous. So we all have a different understanding of neuroception and what we've stored as dangerous. A lot of it is around loss of connection. A lot of what you see in romantic relationships or close relationships is a fear of losing the connection or a fear around connection, because connection is our biological imperative. That's what Stephen Porges says have taught us over and over and over again. And we will do anything to stay in connection. And the adaptations that we did when we were small are the things that we turn to when we're later as adults. So if we run towards, if we get bigger, if we shut down, all these adaptations are the things that we've learned very young, and they kind of are our ways of coping later on.
I was going to go into like the hereditary reasons for it, as in, let's say we want to be part of the tribe. It sort of sounds like attachment styles aren't helpful to you if they are negative, but then actually, if you've learned that it's not helpful to display your emotions or seek extra support, but actually you're going to more likely to be accepted, like it makes sense to then be an avoidant attachment. Or if you are trying to get more attention and you are struggling for it, it makes sense to sort of try and fight for it.
I think our culture kind of supports more of, I wouldn't say avoidant attachment, but this idea that like you need to be independent, self-reliant, and super sufficient, right? And all of that hurts us because that's not how we're wired. We're wired to be in community. We're wired to depend on each other. So our culture pushes, I wouldn't say more avoidant attachment, but our culture glorifies, that self-reliance. And that self-reliance is actually the opposite of what you need to heal.
When it does come to connection, is the thing that hurts the concept that someone doesn't care or just doesn't understand you, as in you're having a conversation, but someone thinks that you've done something that you didn't think you were doing, and then you feel unconnected to them because they're misreading you, and so you feel that they're not empathetic. And then because they've misread you, you think that they're not empathetic, so you then blame them for their actions, and now they feel like you're blaming them for your lack of empathy because you didn't understand them in the first place. Is that part of this?
That we come into our relationships with a perception and a lens, and often couples will anticipate or jump to conclusions without really seeing their partner, without really understanding what's going on in their world. And often miscommunication happens through, a sigh, a tone, so much, so many different things.
I was wondering about evolution then, when it comes to attachment styles. Would you say that it's a feature of evolution whilst we have them and there are really logical reasons, or that it's a bug related to other things like mirror neurons, which are there for other purposes, but happen to end up causing us to have unhealthier attachment styles sometimes, but mostly we'll pick up like a healthy attachment style?
I have a hard time with healthy or unhealthy attachment styles, but I would say that our evolution in this culture to be more success-driven and more individual, our culture is supporting us to move more into insecure attachment styles, like the way in which we're connecting through the internet, we're losing important connections, survival, that hustle culture has impacted the way parents show up for their kids and their nervous systems. So we're moving more and more into insecure territory based on cultural norms and ideas. And it's very sad to see that, we'll probably have more anxious and avoidant attachment styles pretty soon.
One of the reasons why we're having less children is because we just are less economically secure at the age where you should be having children. So people feel they need to work harder if they do. And so they have less time to be around for their kids. But also just attention spans. When I was like 13, 14, you'd go on MSN and you'd talk to someone for like an hour or 2 hours. But like if you match with someone on Tinder now, you're going to have like 5 different messages and like that's about it. You're not going to chat for like an hour. And just our attention goes everywhere. So your attention is less likely to be focused on your children if you're not very good at paying attention anymore, which isn't good.
And presence is the number one thing to build a secure attachment. It's not even love that you need from your parents. It's emotional grounding, unconditional presence. That's what drives all the other things that creates a foundation of security.
When I asked the question, I was more talking about biological evolution over like the 100,000 years rather than the cultural evolution recently. But it was a very interesting answer. So I'm glad that you gave me that answer. But then on more the biological evolution, do you think that attachment styles are more like a bug of it or like a feature that's are there deliberately?
More like a bug or a feature that's there deliberately.
As in like a programming terminology, but so like a feature is like you put it there on purpose, where a bug is like a flaw, but might have a purpose. So as in like, so the mirror neurons are part of our features of evolution. It's there for a reason to help us learn behaviors.
Oh, attachment styles are there for a reason too. Yeah, that's how we adapt. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. I just wasn't sure if they were part of like, because we have things like mirror neurons, which have a reason, they also happen to be there.
So we need connection to live. Connection is a biological imperative. We cannot survive without connection. That is part of being human, and that's how we survive. Attachment styles are just a reaction to how we adapted in our earliest connection. So attachment style is just a way to say these patterns are how you adapted to connection when you were small, and connection is the most fundamental thing that we need as a human. We need connection. We cannot survive without connection.
Yes, in that attachment styles are essential for connection, so therefore they were built into us for a reason.
We need to attach in order to survive, and all the styles, like an anxious person is adapting in their environment in order to survive.
Yeah, we do hear about attachment styles, and it sounds like it's a bug or a flaw rather than a healthy thing that makes lots of sense, which is obviously what we've been talking about is why it makes sense. And so it's nice to make that really clear. So thank you for that. Now I'm to my next question, but like, oh God, I want to shoot myself. But what would be the signs that you do need to look into understanding your attachment styles better because it might be causing you problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I list a bunch of things, but if you're really struggling in intimate relationships with either shutting down or getting angry or getting reactive, or you're feeling like you're always being abandoned, I mean, there are so many kind of red flags around like, hey, this is where you need to heal. And healing is possible, and this is an attachment issue and an early wound. And, life could be a lot easier if we kind of do some of the inner work. But I say the inner work is hard too. But repeating patterns in your life, I think anybody who's listening, if you have that pattern on repeat, there's a good chance it has deeper roots than you're even aware of.
Does someone normally find out about it through going to therapy for other reasons and then realize that this is what they need to heal? Or do you have people more come being like, this is my problem?
Everybody's different. Attachment patterns, attachment styles becoming more mainstream due to a couple books. I think Attached really got it out there. So I think people might not have the label, but are coming to therapy because they're struggling in their relationships. And the label can help. It's not really great to stay hung up on the label. And then other people are like, oh my God, I read about anxious attachment and this is me. And I'm so happy I have a way to identify what's going on in my body and kind of a pathway to at least what the next steps are on my healing journey.
Have you heard of the concept of Steelman and arguing against yourself in terms of how would you argue against attachment styles as being important?
I don't know that I would argue that.
Yeah, I was wondering. Because I'm like, it just seems so important. Like, is there a way to say that it isn't?
I mean, a secure person might not ever have to deal with it, They might never understand the importance of it, maybe not.
Well, I think it really helps them understand the rest of the world around them, even if it's not their own internal process that much, but it's still part of their internal process of how they're attaching and might help them be a better parent.
Yeah, I don't think I'd be the person to argue that they're not important.
Have you ever heard someone try and argue it?
Like, attachment is literally everything. How we attach and our connection to others and our sense of belonging and how we relate in the world, that determines the quality of our life. And it's all relating, and how we relate internally and attach is probably the number one thing that can predict if you have a life that is fulfilling and a safety and a sense of belonging, or it could also be part of why you might be miserable inside, using substances in relationships and not getting your needs met. It's a big influence on your whole life is how you attached.
Spoken like someone that's written a book on it. Have you looked much into the area? Because you mentioned earlier as well that addiction is an attachment issue.
I wouldn't say that addiction is an attachment issue, although there's books on that. I would say self-regulation, or the ability to calm your nervous system down, or kind of all of that comes from your mother's ability. And so turning towards substances and or other things are a way to help you cope with a function or an inability to self-regulate. So there are ways for you to get yourself temporary help. Unfortunately, they have, when you go into full addiction, it has big consequences, but you're really trying to like fill in the gap to a missing developmental link.
It might start as a shortcut to helping you self-soothe, but then it becomes like a dependency that is unhealthy and actually ends up sort of making things possibly worse. Nice. Okay, glad I asked. So in terms of men and women, so certainly things like autism is way more recognizable in men than it is in women, and also often ADHD. Is it that men are more likely to be avoidant and women more likely to be anxious, or is it just that the way that we think about men just makes us sort of recognize it when they're being avoidant, but we don't see their anxious style because they don't exhibit it so obviously?
It's a good question. I think, one, plenty of men suffer with anxious attachment. And I thankfully, they're reading my book. Plenty of men don't, the mother was anxious. And so a lot more than we think suffer. It's just in our culture, we support ways that glorify more avoidant protectors and ways of being. So plenty of men have learned through the culture to not show their emotions, to hold things in, to not express needs in that way. So it's a little bit of both in that it's like nature, we are producing anxious men, but then nurture kind of stops them and makes them sometimes even more avoidant. And it's a complicated question. I think because women are allowed to express more and are allowed to be quote unquote needier, they're more likely to identify publicly and share that they are anxiously attached. But so many men are struggling. And I'm just so grateful for the men who've showed up in my life, who've read the book, who are doing the work, and that the book is really speaking to men. Because when I published, my publishers, we were targeting women. I mean, if you see the cover, there's 3 hearts on it. Women are more likely to go out and buy the book. But I mean, men need this work, if not more than women, because of how much the culture has pushed them into less shifted, more avoidant, glorifying those traits, and they're less likely to get the help and just as much need it.
Yeah, I feel like women are more likely to seek support on that problem, whereas men would find it hard to talk about their friends, talk about themselves as avoidant. Are there links into other personality disorders through attachment styles like narcissism or borderline in terms of, I feel like you might think avoidant is perhaps narcissistic or something.
Narcissism and borderline are really early attachment wounds. They're just really early ones. Narcissism is an infant wound and an infant attachment wound.
Could you just explain clearly what it would be that would cause narcissism through attachment?
Oh God, I don't even know that I would be the best to explain this, but when a mother struggles with seeing her infant separate from her, when the mother is narcissistic themselves and can't see the individuality of the baby and regulate the baby that way, narcissistic babies, I think they struggle with individuation. So they are one energetic unit with mom, but they're never allowed to be like separate, or the separateness ends up creating a lot of pain. They struggle with a lot of shame, internal shame, which keeps them, needing to survive in certain ways. They use people to regulate their nervous system in that way. And they were just never seen into correctly. Some narcissistic children get developed because they're perceived as too special, right? So there's like all different ways. I'm not an expert on narcissism. I just know that narcissism and all access to or borderline, or they're all complex trauma, and all that complex trauma, and usually they're really early wounding. And so we call that early attachment wounding or, developmental trauma.
Thanks for being honest on your levels, but still, I feel like what you said was helpful. One note I did say whilst you were talking about disorganized attachment style was, is there also any relationship between that and ADHD in terms of, obviously ADHD is associated with being disorganized? And I don't know if they're very different forms of disorganization.
Yeah, they're very different. I think ADHD is more on attention, being able to focus your attention. Disorganized attachment is really a painful experience to be stuck in. You literally can't run towards someone and you can't run away. So you're trapped inside your body like an infant would be if they were terrified. And so ADHD is, different parts of the brain, not necessarily trauma related ADHD. I don't know a ton about ADHD. They're just different.
Yeah, I always thought of them as fundamentally different, but just realized that some of the terminology has some similar words and was just wondering the link. And asking the question, I find, always gets you to understand both more in other ways, even if they aren't actually related. So it's nice to ask. So thank you. Okay, then now having gone through that, do you find a form of intervention that sort of works, would you say, the best, besides we already spoke about like co-regulation for people, but how would you help a couple if they had one person with an attachment style issue? How would you help them heal that problem?
Yeah, so I'm trained in something called Imago therapy. So that's a type of couples therapy. It means image, and you're put into dialogue, and you can really help a couple like heal those wounds together and evolve together in consciousness. And I would say if you're listening and you have a partner that wants to get help, Imago, IMAGO, would be my first recommendation. And then my second recommendation, which I'm not trained in, but I also think is very effective, is emotionally focused couples counseling. So people who are trained in Imago and in EFT, emotionally focused couples, we have to do an extra certain amount of years, and we have extra training in just couples work. And you really will get a lot farther than just going to a therapist who says they treat couples but doesn't have additional training in one of those two. There are other models, but those are the two that I have seen work the most.
Yeah, I'm doing one episode a week now where I just go into a deep dive on just like a piece of terminology like imago therapy or motor cortex or something. It's just really helpful. Like, yeah, there's lots of terms that just get thrown around that, like, you mentioned parasympathetic system, and it's just good to actually really deep dive and know exactly what each thing means for people, because lots of people kind of hear it a little bit and sort of know what it means, but not fully. So you said that you have to have a few years training for the imago therapy. What did that entail?
So that entailed in going to 3 intensive long weekends over the course of a year and doing work in between. And then I had a supervisor for about a year and a half. You're doing these trainings. And then you have a supervisor and you're taping some sessions and you're working with a supervisor for a while. I mean, it took me 3 years, but I think you can get trained in 2 years. So you're doing a lot of work over a course of period of time, and you're usually meeting with a group of people, and then you're practicing it, and then you're getting feedback for a year on practicing it before you're certified.
Cool. Can you give me a more detailed example of how that might work? That's, I think, of what sort of conversation you'd go through with people and what your role would be as a therapist to make that happen.
Like in the room once they're in there with me?
Yeah. So what would you, if let's say could you describe a scenario where you have two people and the sort of thing they might be talking about and what your role would be? Go through
So you teach something called the Imago Dialogue. So they come into the room, and what's interesting is they face each other. And so a lot comes up, and then I'm helping them communicate in a certain way with a particular dialogue that's very structured and helps them get to the root of the issue. So if the issue is, I'm upset every time my husband doesn't take the garbage out and this and this and this, we're mirroring it, we're reflecting it, and then we're going to what comes up in your body, and then how early did you experience that? So it's a very awesome way to get to the root of when these core wounds started, how they're surfacing, and what might seem like not a big deal, but they're eliciting big responses inside your coupleship. So I get to stand on the outside of you guys and help you guys dialogue in a way that deepens the relationship and helps bring clarity to what's really going on and fosters vulnerability and safety. And it's a rupture and repair experience. And so the Imago Dialogue is amazing. It's been transformational in my own personal life, in my career. And I really don't do couple sessions without usually going into it, because the couple will just debate, and like, what good am I there? If you're just debating, you can do that at home, right?
When you say the structure of the dialogue, could you give an example of like how you would reframe something? Let's say someone was saying something, then how would you help them rephrase that to fit the format?
Well, I don't know that I would have them reframe anything. I would give sentence stems. So it'd be something like if they're sharing, they'll be looking at their husband and they'll say, "This is what's coming up for me." I might say something like, "And the first time I experienced this was," and give them a stem or help them through different kind of ways of, yeah, giving them sentence stems. But I don't ever want to reframe them unless they're accusing the other person. I'll reframe them and say, "No, what's coming up in me," rather than "you're doing this to me." I'll do some reframing that way. But yeah, it's mostly like giving them the stems and helping them connected to earlier places. And sometimes I have the ability to see things on the outside that they might not. So I might be able to make some connections there and just really hold the space and slow down the dialogue, so they really can start to get into each other's worlds.
When it comes to expectation management, when people come to therapy, as in, I guess everyone's going to be completely different, but is there a general rule? As in, I'm sure people come wanting to like fix things and be able to come to like 3 sessions and then everything's like fine and dandy. But what's the actual average real experience of like, is a couple going to have to come for like a year to reach the things? As in, just wondering.
In my own personal healing, I did most of my work with a brilliant therapist, and it took me like 3.5 years. And I still do my own work, but sometimes it takes a really long time to change patterns. But, I'll say when you're doing really good work, when you're in the midst of it, you can feel the needle moving. So there gets to be a certain point where you're like, okay, this is working, and I need to continue to trust the process. Sometimes it's hard because the process can feel a little out of our control and there's an unfolding that takes place. But everybody's different in terms of what they need. I've had clients be with me for a long time and then step away and then come back. And, everybody's different. And it really depends on a lot of factors that I couldn't possibly have like the right answer there or one answer.
Are there any areas that aren't well researched but really interest you in attachment theory?
I mean, not that I know of. Right now, I'm still a student of attachment theory and I'm still learning from my people. So no, I wouldn't say that. I would say that there's a lot of research that I haven't even touched yet and I'm still learning. So no, I can't say I really want to know a lot more about this.
I guess it's really hard to walk into any kind of therapy session now without an attachment lens. But what else would you say does really impact and cause relationship problems that has nothing to do with attachment?
Sometimes it can be like different morals or ethnic boundaries or different religions that bring them together, just different priorities, competing needs. I mean, there can be a lot of things that aren't necessarily attachment related that can cause family. I would say, and that is attachment related, but in-laws and other family members kind of become, because you have an attachment to your mother and your mother's now in your marriage, that can be an issue, but that's an attachment issue. Yeah, a lot of people come with issues around other attachments for the other person in their life. So like my husband has an attachment to his mom that's impacting me, or something like that can become an issue. But that's also an attachment issue.
Would you say there's anything else that's more sort of psychological that isn't widely recognized in terms of how we create boundaries and stuff? It sort of can be a confusing one for people. Yeah, are there any areas that you think are kind of fascinating and hard to sort of explain to people, that are concepts that are worth them knowing?
Yeah, I mean, even with boundaries, it's like the reason why we don't have external boundaries, is because we don't have internal boundary systems set up for us. I talk about that in our book, but I also talk about implicit memory, which is memory that we store before explicit memory, which is sensational memory that gets stored in our body, and how when we have big sensations show up in our relationship, that's actually memory. And people don't really make that connection until I'm like, oh, that's what it felt like as a baby. You feel that in your heart, you feel that in your gut. And so making that connection actually changes your relationship to the sensation, how you relate to it. You can be kinder, you can hold it, you can bring it to someone, and then we can start to heal it. So a lot of the message in my next book is going to be around memory in relationship to attachment.
Interesting. Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities with physicality in terms of you learn behaviors to flinch when something's coming at your face, and it takes a lot of time to like wire your brain to not flinch towards certain things if you know that that's not going to be a dangerous thing to flinch towards. And it's like these things that sort of, you no longer use your prefrontal cortex because you shouldn't need to think about it. You want to be as fast as possible. And so the emotion goes straight into you, and like that's a feeling.
I would say if you want to look up a concept around that, it'd be neuroception. That'd be a good one to look at. Because our neuroception is built on our experiences of what causes a threat or danger. And so changing our neuroception or working with our neuroception is part of healing. Neuroception was coined by Dr. Stephen Porges. He calls something neuroception of safety. So we're always scanning our environment for safety or threat. And we have a subconscious or unconscious way to kind of notice if there's a threat in the room. And a lot of this is happening below conscious awareness. I guess I remember there was an example of this, that I actually personally can share. Like if I have an abandonment wound and I'm sleeping in the bed and my husband gets up to go to the bathroom, I might be sleeping, but my neuroception will cue that he's leaving, and I'll spring out of bed and I'll be like, oh my God, he's leaving. So my neuroception is constantly scanning, even when I'm not consciously awake, for threats, the perceived threats that it thinks are dangerous. And for me, it would have been loss of connection or someone abandoning me. So even while I'm sleeping, my neuroception is scanning the environment. And it might think that certain things are more dangerous than they really are if they breathe in a direction of where my fear is or what my past experience around loss or connection was.
Have you looked much into how meditation or psilocybin can rewire your fundamental patterns of these thoughts that you don't even think about?
Not so much with psilocybin, but meditation definitely helps build something called dual awareness in our brain, and does help with neuroplasticity, and it does help with creating space, internal space, and being with what's inside. So I would say that meditation very much can help with our reaction time and building insight.
Yeah, thanks, yes. Relates to my experience of it. But yeah, I hadn't thought about it as dual awareness often. I have lots of terms that now, I can't wait to make an episode about this, which is great. Thank you so much. Is there anything I haven't asked you about that you feel I should have asked you about?
I think you covered a fair amount.
Okay, cool. And do you operate online or just in person?
Yeah, I treat a lot of people virtually now. I have an in-person space here in Palm Beach, Florida, but I also treat people virtually via Zoom and my coaching company. So I get to do both.
Okay, cool. And where can we find out about that?
beselfful.com. It's BESELFFULL.com. I am on there, and I have a team of coaches that are all trained in attachment theory and healing attachment issues on my team. And I'm so lucky. I have a great team that
Nice.
I depend on.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a few final questions. One is, what is one of your earliest memories?
Well, I recently over the summer had a memory of what it was like to be inside my crib, which was actually terrifying. So I had an infant memory, and I was like screaming and then collapsing and screaming and then collapsing. So that was, it was an infant memory that came to me that was, really hard to really experience, but I was glad that my psyche shared it with me.
Wow, sounds like a non-fun experience. Sorry about that. What's one of the kindest things that someone has done for you?
Oh God, so many people have done kind things for me. I have a friend, he's like a father figure to me, and his name's Alan, and he has shown up for me in a period of my life where I just needed someone daily to be there for me every day. And out of the goodness of his heart, he just was there for me with no agenda and nothing that he expected in return. And so I was very lucky.
Can I be intrusive and ask what the situation was?
Just different, he's actually helped me through several breakups, but this one was a big breakup. So yeah.
Okay. But in terms of him being there for you, what did that mean? As in he picked up the phone, he just suddenly dropped everything for a weekend and took you out?
Mostly picked up the phone or responded to my text messages.
Okay, cool. Thanks. I just find it really interesting to understand what are the ways that you can be kind for other people that you wouldn't obviously intentionally think about straight away, just sort of what are the different things that sort of delight people and being like, oh, if there's so many ways you can be kind, you know about them.
Very consistently there for me in a time when I felt pretty scared. And so he helped me reach back to a sense of security within myself by lending himself for conversations and text messages.
Cool. Okay. No, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Wow. Well, a lot of lessons there. I totally love the reminder that different attachment styles are not a problem as such, and you are not broken. They in fact demonstrate that you are entirely a normally functioning human that has just responded to your environment appropriately. That doesn't mean there isn't something that you can't improve on or change to get results that you might want, but there is no reason to beat yourself up. Jessica's book, Anxiously Attached, is epic if you liked attachment styles, and especially if you resonate with the anxious attachment style. I could also recommend the book Attached by Amir Levine, and I am conveniently sponsored by Shortform, who do really great in-depth breakdowns of the world's best books and ideas if you want to learn more about a topic or try out a book. And they are offering listeners a free trial and 20% off annual subscriptions by following the link in the description or going to shortform.com/psychology. Of course, book summaries are in no way a replacement for reading a whole book, but they are a great way to quickly remind you of all the lessons or to try a book out before you go on to read the whole thing. Anyway, Jessica certainly gave me a lot of prompts for future episodes. In the interview, we have parasympathetic and sympathetic activation to dig into, polyvagal theory and neuroception that was discovered by Stephen Porges, whose name I have not yet worked out how to pronounce perfectly, but I did find out this week that he emailed me 2 years ago to try and get onto the podcast, and I totally missed it in the flood of daily emails I get from prospective guests trying to get onto the show. But I did apologetically reach back out to him and am excited to have an interview with him at the end of summer. So looking forward to that. We also have Imago therapy to research and emotionally focused therapy. So I've got my homework to do. And if any of those topics really stood out to you, let me know which you would like me to cover first. I also wanted to shout out that this week is Loneliness Awareness Week. In the UK, over 440,000 elderly people are often lonely, and the percentages are similar across the world and only getting worse. So if you are lucky enough to still have grandparents or your parents are elderly, don't forget to give them a call more often. In the UK, there is a really cool charity called 2 Generations that matches elderly people who live alone with young people who are facing expensive rent to solve the problems for both of them at the same time. So if you are in the UK facing expensive rent and wouldn't mind living with someone, then do look into it. Old people are great. They have been through so many things with their lives, and they also don't give a crap about how they come across, and unfiltered opinions are the best opinions. Moving on, if you enjoyed the show, rate it, and if you know anyone that would dig attachment styles, then send them this episode so that they remember to think of you as a reliable source of good quality information. Sharing's caring. In case you forgot, I am talking to any listeners of the show for free to simply learn more about my audience and what you're up to, and it's become one of the best parts of my week. Honestly, I enjoy it so much, so please check out the booking link in the description, and if the timings I have available don't suit you, just shoot me an email. I had a great chat with Koshu from Okinawa this week who sent me an email, and that could be you. Alrighty, life is too short to be lonely, so don't let your attachment styles get the better of you. Remember to be kind to yourself, climb a tree, and smile at strangers. They are all just people.